Hello wild people, welcome to AK Wild One. Today I have 10 safety tips for older hikers who want to survive a long distance backpacking trip. Thank you for tuning in. As we grow older, we're supposed to become wiser and develop that rare trait of discernment. Today, I'd like to share with you 10 of my best ideas for surviving a long-distance backpacking trip, avoiding mishaps, and keeping your name out of the headlines. As I started writing this episode, I came up with 10 additional tips, so expect a future episode on this topic. Tip number 1, this is the most obvious tip, and I can't leave it out. Leave a plan and let folks know where you're going, even if it's only a day hike. If you're on a longer hike or a backpacking trip, make sure you carry an inReach and check in with family members once or twice a day. While hiking the PT solo this past summer, I sent Flash daily reports about my morning location and where I camped at night. That way she would at least have a solid reference point should something bad happen. Remember, no one can help you if they don't know where you are. Tip number 2, anticipate the risks. Research the terrain through which you'll be traveling and pay attention to the weather conditions. Try to identify at least 5 risks or potential hazards you might face before you set out on your adventure. Risks could be traveling through bear country or rattlesnake country, ticks, unstable snow conditions, high rivers, steep exposed ascents or descents, rocky trails, impending storms, etc. This doesn't mean that you're supposed to hike paranoid, but if you can mentally wrap your mind around possible problems before they arise, you can be proactive in preparing for what's ahead. Sometimes knowing what to expect and making a simple adjustment can help a lot. For example, when traveling through snowy country, you can install wider diameter baskets on your trekking poles, which will add a little stability while you're walking across snow. If traveling through rattlesnake country, have a sense of their habits that can help you know when you need to be extra vigilant. Tip number 3, train in a variety of conditions. If all your hikes are filled with those sunny, calm, and idyllic moments, you won't be prepared when conditions turn bad. The other day I was snowshoeing up a mountain and the post-holing was atrocious. And even though it was annoying, I knew the experience would teach me how to adapt when I encountered similar conditions in the future. The same goes with learning how to hike in the heat, the rain, the snow, at night, the wind, etc. It's best to experience those conditions beforehand. Tip number 4, know how to use your equipment before you ever leave home. Set up your tent, light your stove, know how to put on your micro spikes and how to walk in them. Same thing with snowshoes and how to walk in them. Practice self-arrest with your ice axe and how to use your water filtration system. Don't let a long-distance hiking trip be your first time using critical pieces of your gear. The last thing you want to do is to have to pull out the instructions for setting up your tent as a rainstorm pounds away at you, or try to look up a YouTube video on how to self-arrest as you're making your way up Forester Pass. Tip number 5, time the tough stuff for when you're at your best or during optimal conditions. For example, if you're trying to avoid post-holing in the late spring snow, crossing a snowfield in the morning is usually best, or when the temperature is below freezing. You can also hike it at night if you like. Crossing a long stretch of blowdowns can be exhausting, so maybe attacking a long stretch of blowdowns early in the morning when you're rested is a good idea, unless they're slippery with frost or some other reason. Crossing rivers is generally better in the morning when cold temperatures have reduced snowmelt overnight. So if possible, I like to leave my greatest challenges on the trail for the mornings. Of course, this could vary from hiker to hiker. Some folks might believe they perform better during the end of the day, but that's not the case with me. Tip number 6, pace yourself and recognize that many injuries happen when you're tired or fatigued. You're more likely to stumble over a rock when you're fatigued, more likely to trip on a root branch when you're tired. If you feel yourself getting anxious or particularly grumpy, try to force your better judgment into gear. I'm fond of a Yupik elder's advice to me years ago. He said, when you get lost, don't follow your first thought. Take time to play out all the possible consequences of an action, such as, do I really want to put all my weight on that wet, unstable-looking rock in the middle of a stream crossing? Or do I really want to camp under a widowmaker, which is a tree that looks precarious and weak enough to topple over in the wind? Tip number 7, consider the risks and avoid taking shortcuts when doing your camp chores. If you build a fire, you really do need some type of barrier between your eyes and the campfire. If you break sticks, a piece could land in your eye, and the same goes with sparks from a campfire. Also, when hammering tent stakes in with a rock, I prefer not to use the bottom of my shoe. Make sure the rock is big enough so the tent stake doesn't slip and you wind up impaling the stake in your palm. Tip number 8, understand bear country. Usually it's during the mornings and evenings when you're most likely to see bears along the trail. If you see tracks on the trail and think they might be old but you're really not sure, then treat every animal track as if it's fresh. Make noise, keep your eyes open, walk slower and louder. Chances are the bear really doesn't desire to commune with you on a deeper level. When it's very hot along the PCT in Northern California, for example, bears usually hang out near water sources. During those times, it might not be a good idea to camp near a stream or a river. Tip number 9, avoid heavily impacted campsites. I try to avoid campsites that have room for 6 or more tents. They're more likely to have food odors that attract bears and rodents. The Aloha Lakes area in Northern California is a prime example of a busy camping area where the bears made short work of numerous bear hangs a few years ago. It's also a very crowded section of the trail. So I prefer to camp in places that have enough room for 2 or 3 tents if possible. And tip number 10, be wise. You know, when my son and I built our cabin, sometimes we had to place 200-pound logs 10 feet above the ground. And we did this by hand. If one ever came crashing down on us, we knew it could kill us. So before we started moving logs, we recited our mantra: we don't have to be stupid. To carry this principle over to backpacking, it might mean making sure your stove tank is dug in and anchored into the flat ground or dirt a little bit so that it stays stable after a pot of water is put on it, and the valve is off before you light it. You don't want your stove to topple over while it's lit and is holding a pot of boiling water. Also, light your lighter first and then turn on the gas. You could burn yourself if you turn on the gas first and then light the stove. The last thing you want is for a fired up stove to torch or burn you. Also, make sure that when you shut off the stove, you move it out of the way for a while so it can cool. Well, wild people, I hope some of these safety tips will be useful to you as you take off on your grand adventure. Everything I've talked about today is based on experiences I've had or seen. Please feel free to share any safety tips you think are essential for older hikers, and perhaps I'll include them in an upcoming episode. I wish you the happiest of trails, and until we meet again, live wildly, my friends.